That cross section next to the clicking on
Yep.
it. Okay, here we go. Here's your spinal cord right here. This is your spinal cord. All right. Spinal nerves coming out. We'll learn those spinal nerves next week, I believe. I don't think they're today. No, they're not today. All right, so let's just look at the spinal cord. You see that it's skinny right here as it leaves the medulla oblongata. It's pretty skinny. But you see a fat area from about here to about here. Gets skinny again. And then there's another fat area right about here. So it's fat right here and it's fat right here. These are called enlargements. They're called cervical enlargements and lumbar enlargements. The spinal cord gets fat up in the cervical region and down in the lumbar region, getting ready for some plexuses. Lots of nerves are coming out of there making these plexuses. The lumbar plexus and the brachial plexus. All right. So this is an enlargement called a cervical enlargement, and this is an enlargement called the lumbar enlargement. All right. Just so you know, the cervical enlargement delves into the thoracic area, and the lumbar enlargement also includes like T12 or so. It delves up into the thoracic area. So the lumbar enlargement is not only in the lumbar area, and the cervical enlargement is not only the cervical area. They overlap with the thoracic area. It's just that it's mainly in the cervical area, so we call it cervical enlargement. This is mainly the lumbar area, we call it lumbar enlargement. All right. Do you see down here, here's my lumbar enlargement right here. Do you see how it comes to a point? Well, that looks like an ice cream cone almost. You know, an ice cream cone comes to a point. So this is called a cone, and it's actually called the conus medullaris. This is called the conus medullaris because it comes to a point. The tip of the conus medullaris is the end of your spinal cord. The spinal cord travels no further. Nerves do, but not the spinal cord. That spinal cord ends at about L2. Between L1 and L2 at about L2. So this is about L2.
So the other are sacral nerves, down lower nerves.
Yeah. Yeah, so these nerves are named. They're named by where they come out. See, this is sacral nerve number 1 right here. Right here. Because there's the top of the sacrum. So this is S1. But look, it left the spinal cord way up here. It left the spinal cord from the lumbar region. But it's not a lumbar nerve. You actually have to trace it down, and it's named by where it came out of the spinal column, the vertebrae. It came out below the S1 vertebrae. You're going to say the sacral vertebrae are fused. I know the sacral vertebrae are fused, but remember that there's holes in them. They are fused, but there's holes in the sacrum, and the nerves can come out. All right. Next, on the spinal cord, let me skip phylum terminale and do the cauda equine or the cauda equina. You can spell it either way. Do you see at the end of this conus medullaris, you have all of these nerves traveling down still? That's called the cauda equina. It stands for horse's tail. It's Latin for horse's tail. Kind of looks like a horse's tail. So cauda means tail, equine means horse. This is the horse's tail. Cauda equina. All right? And then skip back up to the phylum terminale. That's right here. Right here. The ones to each side of that are actually nerves, the coccygeal nerves, but the one in the center is a phylum terminale. What happens is this. This is not on your list, but there's a sac right here. See this sac right here? That's called the dural sac. You guys may not know, but you're going to learn very quickly. 3 layers of meninges surround my brain and spinal cord. They're the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. 3 layers. The dura mater is on the outside, the arachnoid mater is in the middle, the pia mater is in the center. The pia mater tightly adheres to the brain and spinal cord and actually follows its contours. So the pia mater you have a hard time even separating from the brain and spinal cord. Well, this is the dural sac. The rest of the cauda equina travels through that dural sac down into here. as does the pia mater. The pia mater travels through there as well. The pia mater continues down into what we call the filum terminale, and it helps to form the coccygeal ligament. In other words, your spinal cord is held downward because that filum terminale hooks to your coccyx, your coccygeal bones. Remember, you had 4 fused coccygeal bones making your tailbone, your coccyx? Well, that filum terminale hooks to it. Now you're going to probably say to me, if you cut that, will your spinal cord roll up inside your spinal canal? No, but it's better to have your filum terminale intact and holding it down.
Is there a lot of problems if somebody breaks their coccyx?
No, yes, but the spinal cord doesn't roll up inside you.
Okay.
So it's better to have it there, but it won't. It's not like it rolls up inside you. If
Would
you
they
don't
have to
there.
go in and like reattach?
They
in
might
some
have to do that. It
instances?
depends if there's any pressure up pinching these sacral nerves.
Okay.
And actually, the sciatic nerve comes out of the sacral plexus, and maybe you get sciatica from it and some pinching problems. It all depends. All right? All right. Cross-sectional view of the spinal cord. By the way, we'll be using these same models next week. Okay. First of all, let me tell you how we orient this posterior and anterior. Here's how you orient it. The first thing I do is I look for this dilated root right here. This is called a root. It's actually called the dorsal root, and it's fat in the back. See how the front is not fat? Right there. So I look for this and I say, okay, this structure right here is called the dorsal root ganglia, or singular is dorsal root ganglion. So this is one dorsal root ganglion, this is another dorsal root ganglion. Together these make up these dorsal root ganglia. This is where the chickenpox virus hangs out. This is why you get shingles if you have had chickenpox. How you could get shingles. Hangs out right in that dorsal root ganglia. And then it could come out in your later years and cause you to have a band of shingles around your body. So that's how I tell the back of this. I look for the dorsal root ganglia. This dorsal root ganglia is not out in space. It's still within the vertebrae. Let me prove it to you. Okay. This is the back. This is the front. This is your spinal canal containing the spinal cord. This is the dorsal root ganglia right there. And that one right there is the ventral root. So ventral root and dorsal root, this fat part's the dorsal root ganglia. You see how that's within the intervertebral foramen? So, just in case you forgot, when you put 2 vertebrae together, it forms these intervertebral foramen. That dorsal root ganglia is within that intervertebral foramen. It's all protected. So I just want to show you where that is. All right, so now you know how to get to the back. This is posterior, that's anterior. Let's go right down the list. First of all, motor neurons. Motor neurons go out the ventral root. This is called the ventral root, so therefore my motor neurons are black and red. These motor neurons are black and red. They're also called efferent neurons because they're leaving the spinal cord. Afferent neurons, they're sensory neurons. They're going into the spinal cord. Sensory neurons come into the spinal cord through the back. And that means my yellow and green neurons are afferent sensory neurons. All right? And you can also see that down here on the 2-dimensional model. And it's the same color coding, black and red and green and yellow. And there's also a key over here. You can see the key right here. Calling it motor and sensory. Okay. Gray matter. The gray matter is actually this green stuff, the butterfly looking thing. See, look at it's turquoise here. And then it's like a different green here. It's gray matter. Gray matter is gray because it's unmyelinated. There's no myelin sheath around it. White matter is white because it is myelinated. So this butterfly looking thing right here looks like an H or a butterfly is the gray matter. And then the white matter is all this white stuff around the H or butterfly. Gray matter and white matter. Notice that right here, I'll show you the two-dimensional model first. Notice that right here, that black spot in the middle of my gray matter. I'll take the stick away. Right there, that black spot. That's a central canal. That's filled with cerebral spinal fluid. That central canal is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. Plus there's cerebral spinal fluid bathing around my spinal cord. So there's cerebral spinal fluid in the middle of my spinal cord, and there's cerebral spinal fluid around my spinal cord. By the way, by the time you're an adult, that central canal is probably collapsed and probably has no cerebral spinal fluid in it. But when you're a kid, it's wide open with CSF in it. CSF is cerebral spinal fluid.
Don't you need it?
Nah, not for the central canal. You need it around your spinal cord, though. You'll get massive headaches if you lose it around it. But it doesn't bother you if you don't have it. Okay, notice right here and back here, I have these indentations. Right here and back here. So up front and in the back, I have those indentations. Notice right there and right there. All right. I have this anterior median fissure, and I have this posterior median sulcus. The difference between a fissure and a sulcus is a fissure is big and a sulcus is small. They are both indentations. They are both grooves or indentations. But a fissure is a deep groove, and a sulcus is a shallow groove. So, the picture doesn't really show it well. The two-dimensional picture doesn't show it well. The three-dimensional picture does. I can put my stick right into the anterior median fissure. It's right in it right now. I can't put my stick in the posterior median sulcus because the posterior median sulcus is shallow. My anterior median fissure is deep. So see that? So this is a posterior median sulcus, that's an anterior median fissure. It almost divides my spinal cord into two halves. Not quite. Okay, let's look at the horns of the gray matter. So this butterfly looking thing. Here's an anterior horn, here's a lateral horn, here's a posterior horn. Just where they're located. Anterior horn, lateral horn, posterior horn. By the way, in human anatomy, you can use the words anterior and ventral interchangeably. So you could also call this the ventral horn. And you can use the words posterior and dorsal interchangeably. So you could also call that the dorsal horn. Now, in comparative anatomy, you can't use those words interchangeably because dogs and cats and cows and moose and deer, they're all quadrupeds. But we are bipedal. So ventral and anterior are the same, and dorsal and posterior are the same. So anterior horn, lateral horn, posterior horn. Okay, the dorsal columns. Columns are white matter. Columns are white matter. They have another name. They're called funiculi. And that word's written for you, funiculus. This is my anterior column right here. Likewise, this is my anterior column. So anterior column, anterior column. Lateral column, lateral column. Lateral column, lateral column. Posterior column, posterior column. Posterior column, posterior column. We'll cover this in lecture, but we know the tracks. We know which tracks are in which columns. We know which tracks carry pain. We know which tracks carry pressure. We know which tracks carry touch. We know these things. So we know quite a bit about the spinal cord. You guys will learn some of them, not all of them. By the way, do they have names? Yeah, you bet. All these, we're only naming columns. There's tracks in all of these columns that have names. We're not studying that. Anterior column, lateral column, posterior column. On the other side, anterior column, lateral column, posterior column. Okay, this right here, surrounding the central canal, connecting the right and left gray matter, is called the gray commissure. That's the gray commissure, so that's the gray commissure. A commissure is fibers that go from one hemisphere to another. Even in the brain, that's true. Commissures are fibers that go from one hemisphere to another. So this gray commissure is fibers going from the left gray matter to the right gray matter. You guys understand that part of the spinal cord was cut away. That's why it's two different levels. So this is a commissure, and that's also a commissure. Two different levels, of course. Okay, the white commissure. The white commissure can be seen here and here. It's the white matter connecting the two sides. You can see it here and here. That's the white commissure. So you have a gray commissure and you have a white commissure. Okay, the anterior roots or ventral roots. This is a ventral root. My motor neurons are traveling in that ventral root. From here to here, the whole thing is a dorsal root. And the dorsal root contains the dorsal root ganglion. So if I put an A right here, and I said name that structure, and you said dorsal root, you would be correct. But if I said name that structure precisely, to get full credit, you'd have to say dorsal root ganglion, because I wanted the precise name of it. But it is part of the dorsal root. The dorsal root ganglion is part of the dorsal root. No doubt about it. All right? Oh, I don't even see dorsal root on here.
It's on the back.
Oh, it's on the back. Okay. Let me keep going. White ramus communicantes. Okay, let me show you, let me tell you the story, then I'll come back and grab white ramus communicantes. This is the ventral root and motor nerves are going out. This is the dorsal root and sensory nerves are coming in. That means that this right here is a spinal nerve and it's mixed. All spinal nerves are mixed. And that means they have sensory and motor neurons in them. So this is a spinal nerve. Now that spinal nerve doesn't stay intact very long. It bifurcates immediately, almost immediately. So see this number 26 right here? That's the spinal nerve. But almost immediately, that spinal nerve bifurcates into this dorsal branch and this ventral branch. All right? This dorsal branch right here has a name, and it's called the dorsal ramus. Ramus means branch or arm. A ramus in Latin means branch or arm. So this is the dorsal ramus. And this is the ventral ramus. In addition, there's two other branches coming off. Well, one comes off the spinal nerve and one comes off the ventral ramus. And these are called ramus communicantes. But one's a gray ramus communicantes and one's a white ramus communicantes. Sometimes you call it communicans, not communicantes. We call it communicantes. The one closest to the spinal cord right here is the gray ramus communicantes. The one furthest from the spinal cord is the white ramus communicantes. So this is a ventral root. This is a spinal nerve. This is a gray ramus communicantes. This is a white ramus communicantes. This is a dorsal ramus, and that's a ventral ramus.
So the ramus is, I'm having a hard time seeing the ramus. I'm not sure.
Here, the dorsal ramus looks like it branched off. The ventral ramus just looks like it continues from the spinal nerve. Yeah, so be careful because here's my ventral root. Here's my dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion. Here's my spinal nerve. Here's my dorsal ramus. But that makes that the ventral ramus. And you're going to say it's just a continuation of my spinal nerve. And I'm going to say, yeah, kinda, but the spinal nerve bifurcated, so now I have to give that a new name and give that a new name. This is the dorsal ramus, and that's the ventral ramus. The dorsal rami serve the skin and muscles of my back. The ventral rami serve the skin and muscles of the front of my trunk and my appendages, and even the back of my appendages. These dorsal rami only do, can I touch you? These dorsal rami only do about this area right here. The ventral rami do all the sides, all the front, all your legs, even the back of your legs. And I know I'm getting off topic for lab here, but I wanted to show you another model. Let me do it one more time. Ventral root, dorsal root sensory coming in, ventral root motor going out, spinal nerve. Dorsal ramus, ventral ramus. Gray ramus communicantes, white ramus communicantes. Do you guys see how that matches up? Like always, you gotta look at more than one model quite often. All right, now let me go down through the word list to make sure I named them all. I got the white, I got the gray. Okay, look at this. Okay, so you have to memorize this is gray and that's white. But the way the nerves run is my motor nerve comes out my ventral root, goes into my spinal nerve, and this is not all nerves, these are the ones that enter this area. Through my spinal nerve. Then it goes through my white ramus communicantes, and then it synapses right in here. And then it comes back to my spinal nerve through my gray ramus communicantes. So it actually goes further and then comes back closer. This right here is where they synapse. And a collection of soma in the peripheral nervous system are called ganglia. A ganglia is a collection of soma in the peripheral nervous system. A nuclei is a collection of soma in the central nervous system. So nuclei and ganglia are the same darn thing. It's just that ganglia is a word used for the peripheral nervous system, and nuclei is a word used for the central nervous system. You probably heard of this before. You probably heard of someone having a lesion to basal nuclei. They have to take L-DOPA because their basal nuclei are lesioned. What disease do they have? Not? Did you say Legionnaires? No. L-DOPA. They shake. Parkinson's. Yeah. Well, what do you mean a basal nuclei has a problem? A collection of soma in the brain, central nervous system, has a problem. You have Parkinson's disease. You have to take L-DOPA to help alleviate the symptoms. Okay. This chain of ganglia, the whole chain of it here, you'll see this on the fetal pigs too, is called the sympathetic chain ganglia. This is called the sympathetic chain ganglia. Can't see it on this model, can see it on this model. And yes, the sympathetic nervous system runs through that. You can see it on this model. Sympathetic chain ganglia. Here. And, they're only showing it on one side. This is the sympathetic chain ganglia. Right here. All of this stuff.
What about that one?
Nope. Can't see it on this one. Can't see it on this one. No.
Okay.
Nope. So on this one? Yes. This the one you're talking about?
Mm.
Yes, Kendall. Sympathetic chain ganglia. Sympathetic chain ganglia. There's one on each side, running up and down. Okay. Next word is dorsal roots. We covered. Dorsal roots we covered. Dorsal root ganglia we covered. Spinal nerves we covered. Ventral ramus we covered. Dorsal ramus we covered. Okay, these arteries. Okay, I have an anterior spinal artery and an anterior spinal vein. Really easy. Anterior spinal artery, anterior spinal vein. Nothing to it. The backside's not that easy. Okay, I have a posterior spinal artery and a posterior spinal vein, but then look, before I show it to you, look at, I have a posterolateral spinal vein. Okay, so let me turn this around. You're looking at the back now. What does posterolateral mean? Back and to the side. See this vein right here? This is the posterolateral spinal vein. This other one right here is the posterolateral spinal vein. All right. Now, is there an artery next to my posterior spinal vein?
No.
No. It's all alone. This is my posterior spinal vein. This is my posterolateral spinal vein. This is my posterolateral spinal vein. There is no central artery. So these arteries right here are not called posterolateral spinal arteries. They're just called posterior spinal arteries. This is a posterior spinal artery, and that's a posterior spinal artery. See, the back's not as easy as the front. The front's easy. Anterior spinal vein, anterior spinal artery. Nothing to it. The back is a little tricky. you say to yourself, okay, that makes sense. Posterolateral spinal vein. Makes sense. Back to the side. Posterolateral spinal vein. Back into the side. You would think that that artery right there is called the posterolateral spinal artery, but it's not. It's called the posterior spinal artery, as is that one. This one's called the right posterior spinal artery. This one's called the left posterior spinal artery.
So where's the posterolateral one?
The vein.
Oh, the vein.
Yeah, the vein.
Oh.
Notice the posterolateral is only used for a vein.
Oh.
Any questions about that? Okay, the 3 meninges, and then I'll show you some histology. Where's my, oh, right here. Actually, I have one model that shows it. Yeah, right here. Okay, I have 3 meninges. You'll see this in a sheep brain very nicely. Matter of fact, when you do the sheep brain, I want you to pull on the dura mater and see how tough it is. It's really, really tough stuff. Okay. So on here, this gray stuff right here is the pia mater. It's directly touching the spinal cord. This blue stuff here is the arachnoid mater. It's in the middle. And this yellow stuff here is the dura mater. It's on the outside. I want you to notice that the dura mater stays continuous with the epineurium of these spinal nerves. You can see that this yellow dura mater kind of continues as epineurium. Now I do want to show you one other thing. So I got dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Do you see how the arachnoid mater looks really thick compared to the other two? It's not. The arachnoid mater is just as thin as the other two. Then why the heck did this model make it thick? Because this is where the cerebral spinal fluid is. The cerebral spinal fluid is between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. That's where it is. Matter of fact, that space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is called the subarachnoid space. And that's where cerebral spinal fluid exists. That's how it bathes the spinal cord, is in that subarachnoid space. So think about this. I'm going to come in here and take a needle, and I'm going to go between the vertebrae, and my needle has to puncture the dura mater and get into the, and puncture the arachnoid mater and stop right there and not puncture my pia mater, because you don't want to put the needle into the spinal cord, right? So you want your needle to stop right there. Boy, that would be tough to do. No problem. Not a problem whatsoever. Where does the spinal cord stop? L2. I take my needle, L5, 4, 3, 2. I take my needle, I go below L2, and I know that there's no spinal cord there. There's still dura mater, there's still arachnoid mater, there's still the cauda equina, but when my needle punctures through the dura mater and punctures through the arachnoid mater, it's not hitting a solid spinal cord that it's going to puncture. It's actually hitting a horse's tail, and the needle will actually trap. If you go too far, it won't hit something solid. It'll hit these loose nerves that just slide out of the way.
So is that where an epidural is put in?
No, actually, an epidural, not shown here, not shown here well. Probably shown, yes, it's shown here. An epidural is different. This fat right here outside the dura mater, epi means on top of or outside, this fat right here is the epidural area. Now let me show you the maters on here. Oh, you really can't see them. I can kind of make it out. You guys won't like what I tell you. This is the best model for the meninges, because I can only see the dura mater well on here. And I might as well tell you for the video, just in case I forget and ask in this model. The blue one is the dura mater. The blue one right there. The green one is the arachnoid mater. Those little things right there are called arachnoid granulations. That's how I know that. This is the subarachnoid space. And then I really can't see the pia mater around the spinal cord. I can't see it. But I can see dura mater, and I can see arachnoid mater on here. And I can see the subarachnoid space. Now, okay, not on your list, but just answering the question. This is the epidural region. This is where you put the needle and inject your anesthetic. and it does numb all these nerves up and down through here because that diffuses through the fat and and it numbs all those nerves. Why'd you have an epidural with kids?
Yeah, I've had 3 of them. I was just curious because they said that you stand the potential of getting nerve damage, and I was just wondering if why they would that not work then?
It should work if they did it right.
Well, no. I mean, like if they went down that far, I'm wondering why they don't go down that far if they're worried about that. But
Oh, because with the epidural, they're not even puncturing through the dura mater. They stop. They can feel the needle go through the dura mater. They have to push hard. So for an epidural, they just go in until they hit the dura mater and they pull back a little bit and inject it.
okay.
Because you can put the needle through there and you won't go through the dura mater easy. When you hit it, pull back a little bit, inject. That's an epidural. By the way, I can see those arteries and veins on this model too. Here's the anterior spinal artery. There's I really can't see the anterior spinal vein well, but here's the posterior spinal vein, and here's the posterior spinal arteries. I can see those blood vessels on this one too. Okay, now, any questions about the words on this side of the page? Because the back side of the page